Welcome to Saving Faith and Family in America. Please welcome our host, Katie Gorka, Director of Civil Society and American Dialogue at the Heritage Foundation. We hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you, and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. So the past year and a half has been exceptionally difficult for Americans. I sat at home with my son, whose college shut down for about 10 months. Thankfully, my husband was home, but he was still able to go into his workplace. But throughout this past year and a half, I've often thought of the people who had to go through this alone. So for example, I thought about the young professionals who were probably so excited before COVID that they had finally managed to get their own apartment, only to find that their living space was now their workspace, and they were spending 24 hours a day in isolation. I also thought about friends of mine who are single parents, who now with COVID suddenly went to not only being the sole breadwinner and the sole parent, but also to being the sole educator and the sole babysitter for their kids who couldn't go to school. And I know many of us thought throughout this year and a half about those people who were stuck at home in bad relationships or abusive relationships. We were concerned about families that weren't working well, abusive parents. I think for everybody, it was a very difficult year and a half. And I would say that if ever there was a set of circumstances that could uniquely and powerfully underscore the value of family and of healthy family, it's been the COVID crisis. I'm pleased to welcome J.P. Gance to the Heritage Foundation. He's the co-author, along with Dr. John Van Epp, of Endgame, the Church's strategic move to save faith and family in America. JP is also the founder and president of Communio, which directly engages in the work of helping to restore marriage in America. Now, the work that JP has been doing has been going on for a number of years. Dr. Van Epp, it's been going on for decades. But I think that there is really a unique moment now, because of the COVID crisis, to focus on the family. I think people keenly feel the problems, the decline of the family. So I felt that your book was so timely. I was so excited to find out about it and to find that you were coming out now with this summary of the work you've been doing and a plan for going forward. So I'm going to ask JP to come up to the mic. He's going to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, and then he'll join in a conversation with two men who are also deeply engaged in the work of healing families. So let me just introduce them briefly. No, come on up, go ahead. And I'll just introduce briefly now our other two panelists. So Dr. Jay Richards is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in Heritage's DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. His work here focuses on protecting life, marriage, religious liberty, and renewing civil society. The Reverend Dean Nelson is chairman of the board of the Douglas Leadership Institute and vice president of the Human Coalition. Welcome, gentlemen. JP, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Katie. Really great to be here with you, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this. You know, right now I think our country is in the midst of an ongoing political and economic crisis, and we could make a variety of arguments as to what's driving it, and I'm going to argue that much of this, all of this predates really COVID. That the crisis in our country is fundamentally, it has its origins in the collapse of faith and the collapse of family. Now, let's take those one at a time and look at them. Look at marriage, okay? Marriage has declined 31% since the year 2000, meaning there's 31% fewer people getting married each year than in the year 2000, not ancient history, right? And it has declined 61% since the year 1970. Now, it's sometimes said that marriage civilizes men, and I know Mrs. Gance would agree, my wife would certainly agree. And if that's true, then it also means that we live at a time in our history where there's never been more uncivilized men walking in our communities, right? And we certainly, I could argue, see much of this unfolding in our news. Now, children are very much the victims of this flight from marriage. Right? 54% of children will reach their 17th birthday without a continuously married mom and a dad. Okay, and we know that a child who lives with a man who's not his father is the most vulnerable to abuse. Okay, adverse childhood experiences. Okay, the number of those soar out for children who are raised in homes without continuously married parents. Now, also faith has collapsed, right? In so many ways, you could look at different data points. Gallup came out with numbers in spring that showed for the first time in Gallup's history, we're seeing a majority of Americans say that they don't belong to any house of worship. Now, there's definitely some bilateral causality, back and forth between these two things. Mary Eberstadt, who I think so highly of in her work, talks about a double helix of these two institutions strengthening each other. It's the core argument of Endgame that over the last 60 years, this causality has moved from one side to the other, meaning it's the collapse of family that has driven the collapse of faith. And ultimately, one of the things that we note is that the church has not yet fully grasped this. Okay, we look at just 7 of the best known evangelical and Catholic youth evangelization and youth discipleship ministries. Just those 7 great venerable organizations like Awana, Young Life, Cru, or Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, amazing organizations. Those 7 organizations report spending $1.1 billion annually on youth evangelization and youth discipleship. Then we looked at what churches are spending their dollars on themselves. We did a survey with the Barna Group to understand how they're allocating resources. And we just extrapolated in a very conservative way and found just about another $900 million being spent by the largest churches in America on youth evangelization and youth discipleship. This is nearly $2 billion annually. That number is very likely $4 to $6 billion annually. And I would say as Christians, as stewards of the good King's resources, what is our return on that right now? Right now, we're continuing to see increasing apostasy within our youth. CARA, a Catholic think tank in Georgetown, noted that the median age of a Catholic leaving their faith is the age of 13. Okay, and 74% leave their faith between the age of 10 and 20. So while we're spending the most, more than ever, on youth discipleship, those numbers are not going in the right direction. In fact, the religious non-affiliated keeps getting younger and younger as an age group. So what's driving it then? It's my case that it's the family and the collapse of marriage that has driven the whole bus over the last 60 years. Okay, I'll give you one key data point from the book. Okay, we partnered with Dr. Mark Regnerus on his survey a couple times, and we looked at religious practice based on family of origin. And what we found was millennials and baby boomers, believe it or not, go to church every single week at nearly the exact same rate, if I know one thing about both people. If they both grew up in a continuously married home, there's almost no difference in how frequently a millennial goes to church when compared to a baby boomer. Okay? What's different is that the family structure of millennials has completely shifted. Okay? And what it fundamentally means is that our churches would largely be full today if millennials, Gen Xers, and Gen Zers were to have enjoyed the same family structure as baby boomers. So then what is the church doing about this? Right now, not much. Okay, we've in our data with Barna, we found that 85% of churches reported spending 0% of their dollars each and every year on marriage and relationship ministry. So I say this as an optimist, this is great news. It means the family and marriage is in free fall, and the church is largely sitting on the sidelines. We've not yet answered the bell. We can answer the bell. The church has historically been the greatest firefighter, the greatest disaster response organization in global history. Okay? I don't know if you guys have ever heard of something like a plague, okay, or a pandemic of some sort. It was the church in ancient Rome that ran into Rome to save souls, save the sick. The hospital was an invention of the church. And you see this, the church combated a variety of pathologies in our own country, much closer to our own day. There was a historian said in the early 1800s that Americans drank from the crack of dawn until the crack of dawn. And it was churches who organized effectively the temperance movement that reduced alcoholic consumption by 70% by the 1870s, long before Prohibition. The church can do amazing things, animated by the gospel, to transform culture. And it's time that the church does it. That's the message of the book. And we go into real how-tos of how it's been done. In my work, we've ran a strategic initiative in Jacksonville, Florida, where we worked with more than 50 churches. Through those churches, moved 58,912 through couples relationship education. In 3 years, the divorce rate dropped 24% across Duval County. And we saturated that market with digital outreach so that the church became a light to the community, drawing folks in to invest in their relationships. So change can happen. We have agency. The church needs to focus here in order to save the family and ultimately save faith in America.
Gentlemen, I will let you start if you have questions you'd like to ask or if you want to challenge.
Actually, let me start because I want to underscore, since JP didn't speak for very long, and the book really is sort of revolutionary if you're not used to thinking about these things. And so I want you to spend a few minutes. You said, you conceded, of course, that there's this a double helix or kind of multiple causation. And so the way most people think of this is in terms of sort of secularization. So you get, I don't know, we think that ideas affect institutions. So we imagine something happened in the 19th century, loss of belief in God, secularization, that worked its way through our institutions, including the family, and then started to break down the family. And you're not denying that there's some connection there, but right. the burden of your book is the causation in the other way, in which the breakdown of the family is largely responsible for the loss of faith. So in this case, it would be the health of institutions actually shaping the beliefs that people have. And so that's somewhat counterintuitive. So spend a little more time like justifying that. Like, why should we think that there's that causal direction?
So, great question. So ultimately, let me see, hopefully I won't. Okay, so ultimately, just as you noted, this myth that I think it's not, there is certainly an area where ideas have a decline, but fundamentally the data supports.
Is it me? All right, thanks.
So the data supports that fundamentally the family started to fracture largely with the advent of the sexual revolution. Okay, once, and we go into this and unpack this in the book, once sex becomes decoupled from marriage, okay, then you have a decoupling of parenting from marriage, and you have a decoupling of partnering from marriage. As that's happened, what you've later seen is a rapid decline of faith. You see this in, I unpacked a psychological argument, a series of psychological arguments, why this is the case, and was able to interview my friend Paul Bitts, who has written a book, Faith of the Fatherless, and he in his book, Faith of the Fatherless, talks about psychoanalysis of atheism and agnosticism. And what he sees is very frequently, he analyzes 30 of the world's best known atheists and finds the most common occurring ingredient in their home lives was a failure to attach to a father. That father abandoned them, an abusive father, or a father who died and just wasn't there. Okay, and guys like Sartre, hey, thank you. Guys like Sartre, guys like Nietzsche, okay, the greatest, best known atheists of the last several hundred years. This is a commonly occurring incident. And so what we also know from the social science is that fathers, while we all may know individual great dads who are not married, okay, I'm not talking about any individual vivid example. Generally speaking, the statistics show that an unmarried father is generally uninvolved, okay? And so that means as marriage collapses, fatherhood collapses. And you can't, there's a lot of efforts trying to restore fatherhood in sort of a secular construct, as if fatherhood can be repaired
outside of marriage. While there are individual examples where that happens, if you're trying to get it at scale, you can't do it without restoring marriage. And so, so the social science supports it, and then the psychology starts to help us understand that the collapse of the institution of marriage and the collapse of particularly fatherhood as a result of the collapse of marriage, you start to see the psychological underlying reason for why faith itself is in such flight. And say, you have the reality is, this shouldn't surprise any Christian, right? God has revealed himself as Father, and Christ in so many ways, and both in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, you see that salvation is written really as a love story, as a spousal love story. Okay, whether we see that in Hosea, whether we see it in the Psalms, whether we see it in the Songs of Solomon, whether we see it in Isaiah, in the New Testament with Ephesians and Corinthians, that the marital embrace is an icon, intended to be an icon of the love story between God and his people. And so as that breaks down, as that breaks apart, that institution breaks apart, we don't get the thread of the story. Salvation makes less sense in a Christological sense, right? And so then you start to see why both theologically, biblically, psychologically, and sociologically, why the collapse of the family is driving the whole bus.
Yeah, lots of thoughts. First of all, I want to say, JB, this is fantastic work. I'm grateful that you've done it. We need more of these, like, every generation, every year to reevaluate. And I'd like to take a step back. Talk to me a little bit, the audience, a little bit about your approach, particularly engaging and writing this from a perspective of Catholic and Protestant, why that's important. And why you've taken that approach. And then secondly, sometimes we have this divide between those in the academy and the practitioner. Who is this work for, and how does it kind of bridge that gap as well?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the book ultimately is targeting church leaders, what I would describe as and my co-author and I describe as the Christian grass tops. Okay, pastors, engaged members of volunteers at a church, those ultimately actively participating in the advance of the faith. Anybody and under that umbrella would find the book practical and of great value. Now, why we went with the approach, my name, JP, you could probably guess, and John Paul, and I am deeply influenced by John Paul's ecumenical approach. I think we, as Catholics, just celebrated his feast day, and on the 22nd, and he had such a great. And he, not a lot of people remember, had been invited by John Paul, then Cardinal Wojtyła, to come and preach in his cathedral, and that occurred during the conclave. So he was there while Cardinal Wojtyła wasn't there, and then later they had a great friendship, and John Paul famously said, "Graham, we're brothers," and fundamentally, I think there's so much. I've had such relationships from my evangelical friends who have strengthened my faith in their witness, and I think that's such a gift that. And this problem that we're faced with is not a problem unique to Catholics or evangelicals or Protestants, right? We are in the same waters, and marriage has been pummeled on all fronts, and so we, the full body of Christ, all those united through our common baptism and faith in Christ, need to be collaborating in this fight. And as a consequence, our work as an organization, our Communio's board of directors is ecumenical. We've got some great evangelical Christians, great Catholics. And our staff is also mixed. We employ folks who are evangelical pastors in parish life for years, so that we can, work with churches across the board to strengthen, really strengthen at significant scale, right? There's 25,000 churches of 500 or more people that are evangelical, Protestant, and Catholic. And that's a great place to start if 85% of them aren't doing anything on marriage and relationship. You can produce a major sea change if we move that lever.
JP, I have a question if I could. So I feel like I'm the perfect, my parents got divorced when I was 10. What concerns, do you feel that priests and pastors are sufficiently equipped in the work of healing and
No, they're not right now. So a lot of the work of churches right now in marriage is on two areas. If it exists, there's marital formation, right? Some sort of premarital activity is certainly ubiquitous on the Catholic side. It's fairly common today amongst evangelical churches. And then, see, 93% of Protestant pastors and 87% of Catholic pastors reported meeting with couples in crisis. But overwhelmingly, they admitted that they felt only somewhat qualified in doing that. Okay? So very frequently, the pastor is frequently well situated. The analogy we try to use is that every pastor shouldn't become a Jedi Knight in marriage counseling. That's not necessary. They should see themselves as an EMT, right? If there's a patient's having a heart attack, the EMT doesn't show up and say, we need to do a triple bypass and cut a patient open right there. No, the key there is for the EMT to stabilize the patient and know how to get the patient help. And that's a huge way that pastors can be helpful, okay? And the other huge barrier is that there's this myth and perception that relationship ministry, marriage ministry, is really only for people who are having problems, okay? You go to a marriage course because you're struggling, and so if I show up, I'm signaling to other people that we're struggling. And this is a huge strategic objective that we work with churches on, okay? We talk about a church should have sound vision, skills, and community to have a good relationship ministry. And the vision is not just the idea of the upholding of biblical marriage in the church, okay, although that's certainly part of it. It's also the idea that in this church, everybody invests in their relationships. If you have a great car, you don't wait for smoke to start fuming out of the hood. You bring it in regularly to get serviced, right? We all know that if we want to live a long and healthy life, we proper diet and exercise, right? Same thing with our relationships. Relationships aren't less important than our car. And that should be the kind of common sense messaging from the pulpit and from the church should be the idea that everyone does this. And so then we change the norm, the norms in the church. And then marriage ministry actually needs to start many years before the wedding day. That the collapse of marriage is the biggest threat to the church and the world. How do we come alongside single young adults and support them and building the skills for the right cadence of forming the right relationships? In the book, we talk about the modal time where an individual reports having sex for the first time with someone is before a relationship begins. Okay, there is such a lack of knowledge in how to form lasting relationships, that this is an area where the church can add a lot of value. And one of the reasons I was so excited to partner with John Van Epp was John, more so than anybody I know, has worked in developing resources for singles within a continuum of relationships, so that a 20-year-old, a 25-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 30-year-old is able to understand the right way to attach to someone, the right healthy way to attach to someone, and to discern whether or not someone is worthwhile in continuing to pursue. So all of that is these are all huge needs on part of the church.
If their parents were continuously married when they're being raised, have almost exactly the same percentage that are still faithful, still going to church, which is staggering because that really, I mean, almost more than any single statistic suggests the role of the collapse of the family in the collapse of faith. But then what's missing is, of course, it's the collapse of the previous sort of claim, the secularization theory, that this came from ideas. We got the collapse of marriage. Now we have the question, okay, so what actually caused the collapse of marriage then? You talk about this decoupling, but, and you know, I remember you compared the 20s and the 40s and the 60s. So what was the set of things that led to this massive decoupling? One, like in general. And then in two, since we're at the Heritage Foundation, I have to ask, are there some policies that maybe unwittingly also contributed to this?
We talk about supply and demand side sometimes when I talk to my free market friends on this stuff, that sometimes policy creates the supply that incentivizes bad, less than optimal behavior. And then and there's also cultural demand outside of that. So there's no doubt that the Great Society programs and their existence of providing aid and support in a way that disincentivized marriage and particularly in poor communities is part of that story. But I often pump the brakes with some of my libertarian friends who sometimes make the case that it's just an economic formula. If we can just reconstitute the right algorithm, everything will whip back into place. So as I then ask, is that the reason why, say, you're a 29-year-old grandchild who is upper middle class or better is choosing not to get married or cohabiting, right? It's not the Great Society program that's causing that. And okay, so then the other elephant in the room is the sexual revolution, and then so you'd have to say what drove the sexual revolution, right? Ultimately, the ability to uncouple the consequences of sex, okay, was a huge factor, right? So that once sex was able to be recreational, right? Because that's fundamentally, nobody set out and said, we're going to do this so that it can be recreational. That's what happened. Once you could artificially create a barrier for conceiving a child, and the proliferation of it and the widespread acceptance of it in the culture was a key turning point, right? Which fueled much of the sexual revolution. Okay, so then how do you ultimately as a culture, how do we reconstitute the right cadence of marriage, given the fact that genie's out of the bottle, right? Like how do you do that? One of the big things we use in the book is John's, my co-author's, attachment model, which is sort of 5 dimensions. Going across from no trust, rely, commit, touch. Okay, and no one variable to the right over here should be higher than a variable to the left, right? You don't trust someone more than you know them. You don't rely on them more than you trust them, and you don't commit to them than you rely on them, and you shouldn't be in a state of sexual touch more than any of those, right? And what we know now is from the secular sciences, a huge driver of the loneliness epidemic of suicidal ideation is highly connected to, for instance, the number of prior sexual partners, right? We're told by the culture that you can and should behave as you like, as your instincts would have you sexually, and there shouldn't be any consequences. You'll be happy, it'll be great, and the reality is the social sciences and the psychological sciences are showing overwhelmingly that that's not the case, right? And before, obviously, 1960, we talk about it in the book of what was going on in the 20s and 40s. So you had the beginnings of a sexual revolution in the 1920s. Contraception has been around for a very long time. Okay, long before artificial contraception, there was contraception in ancient Rome that was way more effective than most scholars have previously thought. So this that's not new, but the widespread sea change that were culturally, we stopped expecting sex to be within marriage, fueled much of that of the marital and family decline.
So this is great. A lot of what you've discussed, your friend, my friend, colleague Brad Wilcox has addressed in the past. So let's talk a little bit more deeply about a segment of our population, African Americans, who read the Bible more, go to church more than any other segment, but yet have horrible rates when it comes to all of these challenges. Jonah Goldberg wrote several years ago in, I think it was liberal fascism, that during a period of time, during the 60s Johnson administration, that there were these policies that particularly hurt vulnerable populations, but policies that advocated 100,000 workers going into communities that were convincing people to get onto welfare. My grandfather was one of those that they referred to as the two prouds. These were black men that didn't want to take public assistance because of the idea that black men were shiftless, lazy. So he wanted to demonstrate something different. So we've seen these problems. Even when I first came to DC, there was an article in the Washington Post, "Marriages for White People." What can we do to reaffirm some of the traditions of the past? We put out a policy report recently, The Enduring Strength of the Black Family, because at one point we saw in the African American family stronger marriage rates than in other families. And so what can we do? What have you guys found that we can do we can't put the genie back in the bottle, but what can we do from a restorative standpoint in communities that have been ravaged by sexual revolution and bad public policy?
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, can be made around social justice. Okay, there's if you have great concerns about poverty, great concerns about upward mobility, we have great concerns about education. There's almost no social ill related to what we commonly are concerned about with social justice, and we need to help our church understand that more effective single institution at combating social injustice than a healthy church. Okay, and that I think frequently we separate a conversation. There's areas where we can actually talk about economics, in advance of good cultural ideas, and it's just we can't isolate those conversations, and so the data overall is in our favor, and so helping. And this is across the socioeconomic and racial divides, case everywhere, and certainly it's the case in the Black community. And so helping pastors understand it, know it, and then act on how do you create a ministry that incentivizes and reinforces sound marriages. We're working on a partnership to do just that with a historically black university.
Great.
To apply a lot of our methodologies in ways within black churches, and know that there's a lot of cultural translation to happen to be able to do that effectively. And one of the big things in all churches, one of the biggest, I jokingly tell pastors that any church is basically an inverted nightclub. Okay, meaning like, in nightclubs, there's a lot of guys and not enough women, and so, ladies drink free, and how the club figures out ways to get to increase the gender ratio. Well, we've completed over 30,000 surveys of people in church, and we know that the numbers stand at least 70-30. Okay, women to men. Okay, we're not doing enough to attract men to church. Okay, and so outreach and ministry actually needs to. I'm not saying that we need to get velvet ropes and in front of the church or anything like that, but we need to think creatively about how to get men in. Okay, and we've when we work with churches, I talk about this in the book. There's a great ministry that we followed in Kansas City called City on a Hill that targets single young adults, and they build their outreach around young adult sports, and they build sports leagues, which overwhelmingly become heavily men because that's what they want to do, and then they have a discipler on teams, and they form small groups out of their teams, and they move people into affiliation with church. Right? What are the ways as churches are we identifying and recruiting men? We worked with a very poor church in a migrant farm area with Mexican and Haitian farm workers. Okay, the outreach there was different than what we ended up doing a barbecue cook-off as a way to at a competition amongst men. Okay, so the point is we have to be creative about recognize what the problem is. One of the problems is the sex ratio imbalance is so lopsided in the church, in all churches and in the black church, that we can't pretend that it's not a problem. We have to actually lean into it and try to strategically act to solve those problems.
JP, I want to make sure we give our audience a chance to ask questions if there are any questions out there. Is there anybody? Yes. Who's got the microphone? Oh, thank you. Just hold 1 second.
Yes, you mentioned how like the sexual revolution was kind of pushing this problem. I was kind of wondering if you looked into any other like underlying ideology that kind of supported sort of like the tearing down of the family. I kind of think of the example of like in communism that it explicitly calls for the withering away of the family and replacing it with sexual liberation, or how it seems to be now with feminism is kind of poisoned against motherhood. Is this something you looked at, or?
Yeah, I don't write a lot about it in the book, but when I've given talks, quoted Marx and Engels in their writings on the nuclear family, the intact family, really being a direct impediment to their revolution. Right? There needed to be a cultural revolution in order to do that. Right? That was certainly seen in different ways. BLM had it on their website. Okay, certainly they weren't hiding from that. That wasn't an accident. That's the founder of it identified as a Marxist, right? A cultural Marxist. Okay, there's certainly intentional efforts to bring about the new man, right? And that there's a sort of infinite optimism on the pliability of man who can be reformed to our own whims, right? And that is I've heard said, well, the family's going to pass away, and whatever's next is going to be amazing. Like, even if we, even if we pretend that was true, okay, between here and there is the loss of so many souls, lives, the carnage that will play out, and that is playing out, is so massive that would make such an experiment so cruel, so abusive to children, and really abusive to women. In so many ways, the sexual revolution has been identified as a way to liberate women, but in reality, you would argue that guys seem to be on most base instincts for men, right? Guys can have sex when they want with little consequences, and they can exit whenever they want without any social constraint, right? Like, who's the one benefiting, right? So this is all those things are, there's certainly a deeply ideological driver to much of this, but so many of the message to our pastors and to folks is the science is now so overwhelming that it's embarrassing that people don't grasp or talk about. If you're talking about poverty and you're not talking about marriage and the family, then you're not really serious about combating poverty, right? If you're concerned about education, okay, and you're not serious about talking about the number of families in your school, then you're not really serious about improving education. There's only so much so much of philanthropy and so much of the work of the church actually appears to presuppose that you can't fix marriage and the family. So let's do a bunch of other stuff that's really expensive to try to mitigate the collapse of the family. And it's the argument of the book, and it's my argument, that that's absolutely the wrong way to approach it. That marriage is deeply human heart. It exists across cultures, across religions. Certainly, as Christians, we believe Christ elevated Christian marriage, but still it's a universal gift to humanity. And so there's a lot there that we have to work with if we lean into it and help folks. Certainly, for instance, on cohabitation, which has become, we talk about this in the book, has become ubiquitous within the church, okay, let alone the culture. How often have you heard a pastor talk about the fact that a married woman is the most safe from any form of violence? How often do we talk about that a woman who lives with her boyfriend is the most prone to domestic violence?
That's right.
How often do we talk about the fact that a child conceived in a home without a husband in the home, 40% of them are without a dad by the age of 3. 70% are without a dad by the age of 12. How often do folks talk about that if you cohabitate for a long period of time and then that cohabitation is broken off and then you later get married, the stability of that first marriage it's as vulnerable as a remarriage, right? So a second marriage is more likely to divorce than someone who's first time married, okay? There's a lot of data around cohabitation that pastors need to have at their fingertips when talking about this, because the why is really important, okay? It certainly should be avoided because it is in contradiction to the gospel. There's all sorts of moral reasons why it should be avoided, but we need to help our young people understand that it's dangerous to them. It also inhibits their freedom, okay? Once a couple lives together, you lose the ability to easily discern whether or not this person is someone you should marry. Because now I've got common bills with this person. And once I've discerned that they're not a fit, when do we renew our lease? Okay, or maybe we have a common mortgage. Okay, that's not as easily extricated. And so it actually really inhibits the freedom of a young man and a young woman. And so there's all sorts of good reasons, okay, for why it should be avoided. And we as a church need to be able to speak into that prophetically and in a winsome way, okay? But help our young people know the risks.
You know,
I'm sorry, we're out of time. I'm so sorry. This is a great note to end on. So, people who come to our programs are always asking, so what? What can I do? And I love this book because I think it's a great opportunity for everybody to take the book and take it to your pastor, take it to your priest. I know that's what I'm going to do, and say, here's an opportunity. We think this is important. So for those of us who have children, who have a heart for the struggles that our children are going through in the world, the way the world is viewing relationships these days, I think there's really a lot of hope and promise in what you've presented. So thank you very much. I encourage everybody to read the book. I loved it. I learned a lot. Thank you for being here.